And they set up these little experiments where you had to compare a line. So different 3 lengths of line to a test line. And it was very obvious, what the correct answer was. It's B matches the line. And what they did is they had 5 people or something, and then they had a person that was a test subject. In the first couple of rounds, the people said the right answer. It's B, it's B, it's B. And then they get to the person, they said B, and they go on. But then about the 3rd round, they had all the people say the wrong answer. It's A, when it was clearly B, right? It's right. A. And what they found was that in the majority of cases, people will go along with the crowd, even when they know it's the wrong thing.
Hey guys, welcome to Two Seals and a Walrus, that place where we bring you the highest, next level, awesome, cool content in the discussions with our experts that we have on our show. I am your co-host, Sean Webb. As always, I am joined in studio by our co-host, the two Navy SEALs, the only show on the internet with Navy SEALs as co-hosts. We have Ben Johnson, United States Navy SEAL sniper and medic, and to his right, we have Doug Moulton, United States Navy SEAL sniper. And today on the line, we have Julie Albright, who is the digital sociologist, or a digital sociologist professor, University of Southern California, and an author of a new book, Left to Their Own Devices, which has recently, I mean, I was watching, we're friends on Facebook and whatnot. I see all your posts. Oh, you just launched a new book, and now all of a sudden the thing has gone bestseller. And I was like, okay, now I got to read this thing. And then I realized, holy crap, this is an amazing book that I should have read a long time ago, and it fits hand in glove with the stuff that we talk about on this show, because we're all about consciousness expansion and bringing a higher level of awareness into our humanity so that we can become better humans overall. And then I pick up your book, Julie, and started reading. And, I put out this book a while back, and, I get this amazing feedback, says, oh, this is the amazing book. I should have found this 30 years ago. This is my favorite book of all time. And I'm wondering, why isn't my book bestseller? And then I read your book, and I realize why my book isn't a bestseller, because this thing is friggin' amazing. From go, you start off with like a story of Winston Churchill trying to write a speech in his bedroom. And, from there, you take us through how World War II created post-war materialism and the effects on society. And then chapter 2, you jump into the rise of the communication age and the fourth estate, which you'll have to explain to us. And then through media's effect on politics and governance, and through deregulation and diversification of media, into the effects on society, and the fact that now 61% of millennials get their news from Facebook, and how that's changing our existence. And oh my God. And, the line length study was amazing, where you talked about how influence of others can actually alter your perception of your reality and what you believe and what you will say about truth based on what other people are saying about truth. And I read that thing and I was like, we got to have you on the podcast to have this amazing discussion, because you laid this thing out so well. And it's just so wonderfully articulated that you take us in so many directions, telling us so many stories in this book. And yet you then weave a storytelling mastery that connects them all into this amazing interconnected web. Well, thank you, sir.
Sean Webb.
That then explains the foundation of what's going on with the changes in society, and what's going on with the changes of communication technology, and how it's affecting our existence on this planet, etc. So welcome to the show, Julie Albright.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. I'm going to have to take you on as my manager.
Well, I really enjoyed your storytelling capability and the format that you brought. Where do you want to start? How do you want to take us? How do you want to take our audience into that space of understanding a little bit more about what you are espousing and what technology is doing to us and what we need to keep our eye on? Because you brought up the fact that, untethering is happening in society. And, my take on that is that, we have these devices here in front of us that we're all tethered to, but that these devices aren't tethered to any one thing on the other end, so that we're tethering into something that is becoming untethered, and it's having an effect on us. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would, just ping off what you just said in your beautiful intro there. I'm glad you're excited about it. It was a real labor of love, I'll tell you. And that is that there is such a big impact on society. And I also have, in addition to my sociology degree, I have a master's and PhD in counseling as well.
Oh,
So
wow.
I came to USC to get my counseling degree. And just to give you a sense of how people didn't really understand what you just put into, such a nice format there. The guy running the sociology department was welcoming us, and he said, we're all about new ideas. And if you have new ideas, come on, we can't wait to hear about them. I'm like, this is awesome. I want to study the impact of computing on society. And I rushed up there at the end of the talk and said, hey, I want to look at how computing is really changing society. And he looked at me and he goes, what does that have to do with sociology? I go, oh my God. So,
Did you tell him to look it up on Google?
I thought, I saw my light flash before my eyes for a moment there. I traveled from Miami to LA. I moved across country and, thought I was going to really, forge this new path because I saw this as something that was going to be huge. And, as we know now, walk out on any street, almost in any country now, really, you're going to see a kid with a phone, head, neck bent over, looking at that phone. I mean, this has become sort of a universal posture now in just the span of a very short period of time. So I guess I would say now the wave has risen up and met me where I was. And my mother used to say, people don't understand you because you're so far ahead of everybody else. But
3 steps.
I was just going to say, you think 1 step ahead, you're smart, 2 steps ahead, you're genius, 3, you're crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm right on the edge there.
Yeah.
Right on the edge. So, but now the wave has risen up. And what's happening now is that people are starting to understand the enormity of what I was beginning to talk about. Back then, I did my dissertation on the topic. And now this book is the culmination of my thinking to date about some of the changes in society, in our social structures like family and church and community and workplace, and then how it impacts us psychologically in our bodies and all these sorts of things, and how we connect to the environment. So that's really my aim with this thing, is to kind of put it in a format that the average person can read and understand and enjoy and really get it. So I guess you could say there were, 3 big drivers of social change. One is the printing press, that allowed people to read and disseminate information, and it wasn't just the upper classes or the church that had it.
Right.
Second, the Industrial Revolution, which really brought people from the farms to the cities and changed the way we work, the way we live. It drove urbanization, which is a trend that's going on to this day, and how we live and all. And then thirdly, now we're in the digital era. And I would suggest that, comparing these 3 great eras, I would say the digital era probably has a broader and more deep impact on just about every aspect of life that you can imagine, comparing to the others that I was talking about there.
Yeah, one of the cool things, I went to Florida State for communication a long time ago, and I got a chance to write a book that wound up being a chapter in a collegiate textbook about, and I basically explained the expanding pie theory about, the population increase, and it wasn't like this new, they were calling it the internet superhighway back at the point that I was
I remember that.
writing about it such a long time ago, but that how, communication technologies were going to increase the size of the pie. It wasn't a smaller sliver for, there are certain things in communication technologies that replace the things that preceded it, such as, cassettes replaced 8-track tapes, and CDs replaced cassettes and things like that. But then there are new communication paradigms that allow us to expand the pie, so to speak, expand the ability to consume media and change really how human life is lived. And, like a great example is Facebook. It's like, when you lived in the 1980s, you lost somebody's phone number, they moved away, you never heard from them ever again. And now today, You know, you're hearing from all these people. I heard a comedian.
All your exes.
Yeah, all your exes. I heard a comedian say one time, he's like, yeah, I treated people like I was never going to see him again, and then Facebook ruined my world. But that's really having an impact on, and I thought it was going to be a positive impact in that, you know, when we, previously, we had to simply accept what was being said about foreign cultures or foreign ideas or foreign religions or foreign whatever it was, the other that existed. And nowadays we have the ability to reach out and touch someone and get it firsthand from the horse's mouth of someone else's you know, mental or intellectual perspective on something or their belief system, et cetera. And we have the ability to connect with people. But then there are also these potential negative side effects and, you know, that need to be managed. And I thought you laid these out in your book so well. Now, you spoke about something called the fourth estate. Is that what we're now able to call this communications paradigm shift?
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot there, so I want to unpack that a little bit. An interesting study that came out a couple of years ago that was one of the influencers of this chapter, which is called Synchronization and Harmonization, was this idea that millennials, more than any group, who are the ones that are growing up as digital natives, you know, in a world where there always was an internet kind of thing, you know, from when they were, you know, kids onward, they are most likely of any group to see themselves as what they call citizens of the world. And part of that has to do with, you know, the CNN effect, watching a war, you know, in real time kind of thing. But, you know, the advent of the internet and then the advent of social media really did allow people to sort of have that, as you said, view on the ground, that firsthand view where it turned everybody into a broadcaster. So there's this notion of sort of citizen journalists now that are photographing and filming social injustice or things that are going on in their countries and beaming it out to the world on places like Twitter. And it's actually changing the world. You know, government's been overthrown in the case of, for example, the Arab Spring and other things. And just through the power of the citizen journalist, if you will, people that have the ability to broadcast things. And it really does shift the power dynamics from, you know, the big broadcasters, the big television channels and news channels, you know, to anybody can film on their phone now. So that integration of a video and a camera into the iPhone originally really changed the world. And then connecting that through social media and being able to broadcast that out. Those two technological developments have really changed.
Yeah. It certainly took the gatekeeper out of the loop, which, you know, a lot of people won't understand from a communications perspective in mass media. But when, you know, we had radio stations and television stations, like 3 channels. I grew up in an environment where we had 3 channels and maybe the religious channel way up the dial somewhere, and then the PBS station. But we had NBC, CBS, ABC, and that was it. And there were people who just had editorial decision about what shows went on their air and what news stories particularly were covered by their newscasters, and that set the tone for absolutely everyone. And I think there's a huge shift now that we no longer have as many gatekeepers that control what it is that we see.
That's right. And you know, 2 shifts about that happen. One is good and bad. And I guess that's one thing also responding to your entry point to this. I think there's good effects and bad effects to these things. You know, like you said, it's fun to keep in touch with people maybe you went to high school with and you moved across the country. You know, it's fun to reach back and talk to people that you knew as a kid or something. But there are also some negative effects. And as you said, when we moved from the mass media model, which is the Walter Cronkite I talk about, who was the most trusted man in America, by the way, at his time, the newscaster, you know, and people would tune in every day. You know, there are just a couple of channels, as you were saying, to watch the news together. Not everybody had TV sets, and they'd gather around like a little tribe of family watching the news, you know, at 6 o'clock or something every night. So people got the same message. And so it sort of brought together, in a sense, the culture, because people were getting the same message. There were also several regulations in place, like the Fairness Doctrine, which I talk about, the idea that if you put on an issue, you have to show both sides of the issue. If you put on a candidate, you had to put on the opposing candidate. So, and they also had it so it was sort of illegal or against the regulations to editorialize or just have an opinion broadcast, in a sense. It was supposed to be more objective. So with the removal of those regulations on the media and then the insertion of social media, what we have now, instead of a mass culture where we're seeing both sides of an issue, for example, before voting, now we have news which is branded, you know, for example, more conservative or more liberal, and people just tune into their channel, their style, their political style, and then they go online and it's the same thing. People tend to cluster with people that believe things they believe. It's the whole birds of a feather flocking together notion, right? So, so what happens is you can insert now, and this is where my concern came about, why I wrote that chapter, is there's something about social influence. And I talk about the Ash conformity studies, where this came about after World War II, when then social scientists and psychologists were trying to understand, how did the Holocaust come to be? How did people do these terrible things? You know, we want to understand the mind and behaviors. And what they found was that if the majority of people, and they set up these little experiments where you had to compare a line, so different 3 lengths of line to a test line. And it was very obvious, you know, what the correct answer was. It's B matches the line. And what they did is they had 5 people or something, and then they had a person that was a test subject. In the first couple of rounds, the people said the right answer. It's B, it's B, it's B. And then they get to the person, they said B, and they go on. But then about the 3rd round, they had all the people say the wrong answer. It's A, when it was clearly B, right? It's A. And what they found was, and this is very interesting, in such a stark example, that in the majority of cases, people will go along with the crowd even when they know it's the wrong thing.
Wow.
Because of the social pressure to do so.
Right.
So my point was, okay, if we know that, let's take that as a social psychological fact, right? Now let's translate that online. So I can now create a crowd of fake people, like bots and things like that online, that will pressure people. This is, or disseminate false news, for example. And because people are in these little siloed, now contained groups that are like themselves, they don't hear the other side. And then the news media doesn't bring the other side. So it's very easy to get very, very disparate views on things. And that's what the studies by, for example, the Pew Research Center show, that let's say in the 60s and all, when I'm talking about the 70s, the Republican Democrat views were more overlapping, and now they've become more disparate or distant from one another because of these informational echo chambers, I would call them, starting from the mass media and then echoing into social media. And it really does challenge our democracy in a sense if you're only getting one side of the story, and that side can be amplified and twisted by the insertion of false information in these social networks.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. And you see it, you know, and that's what basically happened this last election with, Cambridge Analytica trying to social media hack the U.S. presidential, national elections, and the Brexit vote, which they were successful at doing. I unfortunately was speaking at the Science of Consciousness conference on artificial emotional intelligence, and a week before I was going out to the conference, I got a call from someone who was very connected with the NSA, let's say. I won't mention their name, but they wanted to have a meeting, and we sat down, and it turns out a book that I wrote in 2012 on how emotions work in humans and computers, and how to place information in front of a real human being that then evokes an emotional response, which then evokes, of course, memory retention, because emotion and memory are inextricably linked. And all of this, I kind of explained the way to hack a human mind to say, hey, if you want to influence somebody emotionally and then also through their actions later on, here's how you do it. And then, oops, 4 years later, Cambridge Analytica did exactly what I wrote about in 2012 with the election, and they did it with the national election and the Brexit vote. And I thought, that fucking sucks.
Basically, Sean's responsible for Brexit and Trump being
No,
president.
not true. They did a lot of science.
Haiti too.
They did a lot of science beyond what I had put in the book. But I mean, there is a lot of science to the ability of influencing people emotionally to get them to take an action, because emotion evokes all of our human action at that point. And you can literally tell people who they're going to vote for on election day if you do it the sneakiest way, and you do it with social media and emotional evocation.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and so we're really living in a world that's, it's a dangerous world of tomorrow, because when you talk about the ability to hack an election, you talk about the ability to use social media to influence people's ideas and actions, talk about an artificial general intelligence getting a hold of that and being able to do it 24/7, 365 through an automated process, which has its own goals, by the way, that are not set by a human being. Holy shitballs. Now we're talking about Skynet.
I know. It's really disturbing. And you know what else is funny about it? You know, I've tried to disseminate these ideas in my social groups, for example, and I taught social psychology at USC for years. And one of my favorite classes, I called it How to Win Friends and Manipulate People. You know? That's what it's all about. But what the funny thing is, when I brought these topics up just to kind of seed these ideas so people can be aware and start thinking about what do we do about this, right? You'd probably be surprised at the number of guys that said, oh no, I'm not influenced by anybody. But yeah,
I'm such a hang up with this.
Oh no, I'm not. I'm not me. And I think to myself, okay, look at the clothes you're wearing. And isn't it funny that they're exactly like the clothes that all your friends are wearing? And I notice you don't have face tattoos or piercings in your, face. So in other words, he's conforming to exactly what all his friends are doing via wardrobe and hairstyle, and tattoos or not, or these, that, and the other. But he's not influenced by anybody. He's a rugged individual.
That exact mentality. I could go on for an hour about this, but that exact mentality is why people followed Hitler to do what he wanted. They thought they were unfathomable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The moment you think, that would never happen to me, or I would never do that, guess what? You're now susceptible to that bullshit.
Right, a little bit of
you got to leave that 5% back door open to question everything.
Yeah, a little bit of Dunning-Kruger going on there, right? In that I am the influencer, I am not the influenced.
Yeah, I'm not influenced. And it's almost like, you guys are probably the most masculine guys you could ever find in the world, I would say. Yeah, I mean, come on, you guys.
Hashtag facts.
You're like superheroes. But you are also, I think, intellectual in the way to question. And that's part of how you do what you've been able to do, I think, is, you know what I'm saying? You're able to go, okay, wait a minute. And a lot of those, what we call cognitive biases, where you have kind of a blinder effect going on. I've been in some conversations with some of the three-letter agencies as well about that very thing. And the idea of intelligence agents, once you get that blinder on, it's hard to go, okay, let me step back and question those assumptions and those ideas. But the guy who I'm not influenced, then influence becomes invisible and you're not alert to it. And then you're not like, wait a minute, you're not going to be, forewarned is forearmed, you're not going to be forearmed because that's not going to happen to me, like you said. So, right. That's a problem to overcome. And how do we get people to understand that, the studies show, as I said before, the majority of people will go along with the crowd, even when they think it's wrong. They start questioning themselves, or they think, well, I don't want to rock the boat, for various reasons. They're going to go ahead.
The boat.
Ambivalent skills.
Yeah.
Ambivalent skills.
Yeah, you guys are sinking the boat with missiles. Through that boat. Yeah.
So what do you think the biggest challenge is of technology and this, social media wave of interaction and things like that? What do you think the biggest challenge is for society and for our culture as a whole? Do you think it's the the separation of ideas in the fish tank or echo chamber effect that's going on, or is it something else?
Well, that's one thing. And if you take it at different levels, I think, so on the level of the societal, I would say that these issues that we're discussing are critically important. And there's another sort of mindset, if you will, that's very ingrained here in America, and that's the notion of free speech, right? This idea that, you want to be able to say anything free, and that accurate speech will sort of overcome inaccurate speech.
Right.
But,
Yeah, once never.
Said nobody ever. That never happens, So, the idea that we can now automate these social processes that are well understood, and that's what Cambridge Analytica did. And what they also did is they ran what's called the Big Five, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's a personality factor, sort of a battery psychological test, which will kind of discern your personality characteristics and things like that. So what Cambridge did is they found out who's most likely to be anxious.
Neurotic.
Yeah.
Neurotic, that's right, what is called neuroticism.
Yeah.
And then they can say, well, now we can look at social media, and through your likes and through your activity, I can find out exactly what you're anxious about.
Yeah, trigger neuroticism.
Yeah, if you're anxious about guns, or you're anxious about, people killing animals, or, whatever it is you're anxious about, you can say, oh, and you can ping that exact thing and say, oh, did you know they're going to take your guns away? Wait a minute, And so that's what they did. It was a very hyper-focused thing, which sent people to literally hundreds of thousands of websites to amplify that very thing, that micro thing that they are worried about. And all of a sudden, if you got that pet issue going, you've activated the emotion, as you were saying earlier. Well, now all of a sudden you've got somebody, well, I'm not voting for that person, because you've got their pet thing, and you've, put a little wedge in it. So That's my worry on the societal level, is that we're automating these sort of well understood social processes. And think about it, these became, we've evolved these things so we can get along as a society. Think of a little tribe. I'm going to look and say, well, what's everybody else doing? I don't want to be that far outside as an outlier, because now I'm not going to be part of the social group. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So anyway, the idea that nation states or dark actors of some kind can target and really manipulate people, I think that we don't have a clear answer to that, but I do believe the platforms bear some responsibility, like the Twitters and the Facebooks, to find out where these things are coming from. For example, if we've got campaign slogans coming out of the Ukraine, maybe we want to think about blocking those, and that's just, a start, but I think that's part of it. So that's one side, and that's on the societal. On the individual level, what's happened is, for young people who are more connected than ever, more dating apps than ever, more ways on social media to have friend connections, networks than ever, young people are more disconnected, or what I call coming untethered, than ever before. Millennials are much less likely, for example, than older folks at their age to be married. For example, if you look at older, let's say those that came through World War II and whatnot, about 65% of them were married by age 32. Now it's 25%. So
Good
the
for them.
majority of young people are not getting married. They're not buying homes. They're not having families. They're not going to church. They're not joining political parties or community groups or the yacht club or the golf club or whatever sort of group you could think of. They're unhooking. And in fact, a quarter or more of millennials have no friends at all, by the way. 65% of high school students have never been in a relationship. Now, you think about people used to marry their high school sweetheart. What high school sweetheart now? So this idea that young people are coming untethered, and what we know from sociological studies is that these things like the church and the family, and I'm not trying to be Betty Crocker 1952, let's get that straight. I'm just going by the research and what's changed. And
Right.
what's changed is all these things we've unhooked from. And guess what's happening? Now anxiety and depression are going through the roof. The highest rates in 30 years
Yeah.
we're seeing in the colleges, for example. Kids' suicide from 10 to 34 is the highest rate in decades. And, you know, so I'm concerned about the mental and physical health of young adults and kids, you know, teens, because the internet and connectivity is enabling them to disconnect. And it's kind of got addictive qualities where, you know, you can sit in your room and watch these things all day long, or play games all day long, or watch TikTok videos all day long and never see another person. And
Yeah.
in fact, young people now, the majority of them say they talk more via text to their friends than they do face to face.
Yeah.
And the
You think that's
problem
just the
is,
chase on, you think that's just the chase for dopamine? I mean,
yes,
basically,
I
we're just chasing dopamine. I mean, it used to be that, you know, we had to go outside and we had to meet people and we had to tell a joke and laugh together to get that dopamine rush, or
yes.
to, you know, that type of thing. But now it's like you're bringing dopamine right into your room and you don't even have to leave your underwear.
You don't have to go anywhere ever again. And then, you know, delivering food through the Grubhubs and the Postmates and all this thing, Netflix, like you never have to go anywhere. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening. And I just gave a talk over at Google, and one of the fellows was from Ireland. And I know that a lot of bars, you know, people used to go gather at the, you know, remember Cheers, that TV show, you know, people would gather and know the bartender, and a lot of young people aren't going to the bars or the clubs or any of these gathering places at all. And this fellow on the phone from Ireland, he goes, oh yeah, the pub business is way down in Ireland now. So this is happening all around the globe. And in fact, we've fallen below replacement rate of having children now in this country, which has a long-term impact on the GDP, because
Sure.
you don't have workers coming up the pipeline eventually. So
Yeah.
I mean, this has major business, finance, governance, all sorts of implications of coming untethered, and not to mention the physical and mental issues. So, you know, again, I'm not trying to be 1952 again. I'm not trying to be Amish, throw out all your devices, you know, get in your, you know, I mean, they may have it right, actually, but, you know,
Right.
that's not really reasonable. But, you know, people aren't going to throw their devices away because it's so intertwined into our modern life. But I think we need to be more conscious and aware of how we're using, how much we're using, and also do things that don't have devices involved, like face-to-face socializing, going out in nature, walking, you know, going out and doing physical things, for example. And, you know, hopefully we can regain our health again.
Yeah, you know, I'll tell you this, your book and other sources, it wasn't just your book, but it has caused me to change how I am parenting my 9-year-old son, in that he's now just getting to the age where, you know, he's doing Fortnite on PS4 a lot, and he's interacting with his laptop, and I've mandated that he's going to have to learn coding and hopefully enter artificial emotional intelligence arena so that we can build a real emotionally intelligent chatbot, and kind of keep that in-house without having to unleash those algorithms on the world to where people can misuse them. But he used to have multiple hours on the weekend and during the week of playing video games, and his emotional regulation was horrible. He would have all kinds of negative effects of being taken out of the game earlier, being shot or whatever it was, and he would freak out. And then when I told him it was time to turn it off, he would have extreme emotional reactions to that, and he would be a pain in my ass for hours afterwards because I cut off his PS4 time earlier. He didn't want to go out and do, you know, chores or errands or go to the store or whatever associated with the chasing of the dopamine. And I tell you, we limited his hours on the screen to 2 hours on the weekend each day only, which is maximum. Sometimes he doesn't even get that. And he is a joy to be around now. His emotional regulation has gone through the roof. He's able to handle the swings of life. And he gets out and he exercises more, which I know is good for his neural development. And, you know, he has a lot more time practicing with his soccer ball and stuff like that. And it is going to positively affect his life, because that has, you know, because I know neuroscience, that has a plastic effect on his brain and is going to change him moving forward.
Well, they're finding now, since I wrote the book, and there's a chapter on the brain and the development, a chapter on the body, chapter on growing up digital. And they're finding that kids that have more screen time now have lowered levels of brain development than those that have less.
Yeah.
So
Surprise, surprise.
surprise, surprise. Yeah. So, you know, and it's funny, I was going to begin to write more about this, but when I started looking at all this stuff, they talked about oftentimes the digital divide. You probably heard that phrase, but the idea that, you know, wealthier folks are going to have computers and internet connectivity, and that lower socioeconomic folks, minorities, were going to have less access to computing and to screens and to the internet, and that was going to hold them back economically in terms of learning and things like that. But actually that's starting to flip now. And kids from higher echelon socioeconomic families actually have less screen time. And in fact, some of the private schools like the Waldorf that I talk about in the book, they don't have any screen time. So they're doing things like the arts and movement and dance and you know, all these sorts of face-to-face bodily involved crafts and things like that, compared to schools of lower economic kids that have screens all the time. So what's happening is, what I would suggest is a new digital divide is emerging. And lower income parents, by the way, say that there are screens on almost constantly, including a television screen. So you've got constant noise, constant stimulation, no quiet time, no thinking time. And people are saying that, you know, it's impacting kids' physical activity. For example, a third of kids in LA and New York have been sent to occupational therapy because they're not getting that mind-body connection in their brains, as you were saying, and they're falling out of their desks at school. They don't know they're on strength. They're shoving kids real hard. Well, there goes a fight starting, right?
Sure.
And as I've been on my book tour, I've had people rushing up to me who are speech therapists saying, oh, we're seeing developmental delays now in speech because kids aren't speaking, they're texting or typing in a game. So that's happening. So there's all sorts of effects that are unintended that, again, we need to rebalance our lives, I think, between the analog, our physicality, how we've evolved over all these eons to be and to learn. Our brain-body environment connection has been severed by digital technologies, and we need to reconnect that, I think.
Now, what do you think is a good exercise that people could do both for themselves and maybe even for their kids, if they're parents who are watching this, or just to enrich their own personal lives from their own personal practice? I mean, would you say cutting down on the Netflix or cutting down on the online gaming or something like that? Or what are you suggesting that people do?
Well, I'm suggesting it's holistic. I'm looking at this as a system, in yourself, in your body, in a family, in the community, in the world. And I'm suggesting that we need to do a series of things. One is eat fresher food. You know, we're eating too many processed food, which is a leftover of our industrialization of food, you know, and that's having some bad effects. We need to eat fresher foods. We need to socialize together without devices. So for a family, this can mean having a family dinner without the phones, and that's the policy. And there's that little sacred space of time where you're together without those things. The other thing is going out, being physical, being out in nature. Again, these can be great family activities. Go out for a hike, go out and just for a walk. You know, any of these things naturally help the body to bring dopamine and bring also the connection again together and talking together and things like that. We're losing some of our social skills, which then drives loneliness and drives all these other things amongst young people. So, you know, the practice of just talking together is important, and it's a socialization factor for young people. So, you know, eating healthy, being physical, getting out in nature, spending some time without devices together in whatever that activity might be, I would say that this is a good start.
You know, a friend of mine, Paul Zach, wrote a book about oxytocin, the love hormone is what I called it, I think. have there been any studies about screen time and oxytocin levels? Because that certainly has a direct correlative effect on well-being. Have you seen any of that science?
Well, here's what's going on, which is interesting, I think, and we're missing that. There are studies that show that even holding hands with somebody lowers your blood pressure, lowers your anxiety level. That human touch, oxytocin is generated when women are breastfeeding babies, for example. It's a bonding hormone. So guess what's happening now? As young people are losing these connections, are untethering from marriage and family and children, all these things that stabilize them and provided comfort and stability, mental and physical health. Well, guess what they're doing now? They're replacing that with pets. There's been an 86% increase in pet ownership over the last 70 years here because, you miss that. And that's part of that oxytocin. You're touching and getting comfort from a dog, for example, man's best friend. And I think that's really interesting. People know they need something, and that's where they're sort of going and channeling all that need is toward their pets now. So pets are the new family.
That's cool. That's kind of a positive side effect of what's going on. I love animals. We had 2 huge dogs for 15 years from the time they were born until we had to see them off. And Doug brought his dog in with him today. He brings his dog up for recording days. And of course, Ben saves animals in Atlanta and has a house full of various pets. Yeah, we're kind of compassionate on the animal side of things here, but it's a good thing. That's a good side effect of this whole thing, is that maybe we can connect with animals more, we can become better humans. But what kind of future do you see if we stay on this path without any mitigation? Will it eventually find an equilibrium, or are we headed off a cliff?
Well, I just don't think people fully realize. That's why I wanted to write this book. They don't realize, young people, for example, that are unhooking from all these things, they think they're free. There's all this freedom. Well, yeah, you're free, but you're also lonely and you're also getting depressed or anxious. They don't really realize. I don't think they're really putting the dots together. Right. And for young people trying to compare themselves to these fabulous lives they see on Instagram, for example, and can never measure up to lives that are photoshopped and photo-tuned and perfected to a point where it's just unreal. I think for young people, it's got to be just so hard to grow up in that world, So I really just don't think that people have really put it all together. We came rushing out of the box with the iPhone, and it was so exciting to have a computer in your pocket and you could do all these neat things. And then came the Facebooks and all that. And, pretty exciting times, heady times, and I guess that's where I'm at with it. We sort of rushed out of the box like a horse race, at high speed. There we go. But it's been enough time now that I think we can kind of step back. And that's what I'm encouraging us to do. As a society, as communities, as universities, as churches, as families, and say, let's look at our use of devices. Let's look at our other behaviors. So that's the whole key, I think. It's not simply devices. It's the other behaviors that aren't happening that led to and facilitated mental and physical health that have gone, by the wayside. Meanwhile, we're just so immersed in digital culture and technology. So that's what I'm saying. Like, let's look at what we left behind and maybe reintegrate some of these things into our life so we can be happier and healthier as a society.
Now, are you a fan of like spiritual retreats or meditation or mindfulness training or anything like that? Or is that too contemplative or quiet of a discipline in relation to what we're dealing with?
I think it's good. And I guess one other thing I want to say here that I've been thinking about is that, as young people untether from all these stabilizing what we call social structures, this is the church and family and these organizations that we've been talking about, relationships, one of the last bastions available, even though we've got this rise in the gig economy, which is also enabled by digital devices, one of the last bastions where young people can potentially anchor themselves is the workplace. So this idea, like maybe we have some kind of mindfulness or yoga practice at work, or we have some ways that we can socialize together at work. And I talked to some of my students about this lately, and they want opportunities for these things at work. They want health at work. They want connection at work. So even though this is not the job of the workplace, I think smart managers and smart business people of the future are going to integrate and retether these young folks within the workplace environment, because it doesn't do the workplace any good if their employees are melting down.
Right. To increase the emotional intelligence in the workplace, you can often create a kind of a society of bonding within the workplace environment itself. And I just gave a talk last week, as a matter of fact, to Doug's fiance, who put together about, I don't know, 60 or 70 HR executives, regarding how they can improve their workplace and improve their engagement in their employee base and increase the well-being of their, workers. And my talk was on emotional intelligence and relating to other people and being able to deal with your own emotional turmoil, certainly by understanding how your mind works and how your brain works, and putting yourself into meta-awareness to be able to downregulate that stuff through the physiology of the brain. But then also, by the way, if you learn how your own mind works, you learn how other people's minds work, and that increases your empathy and compassion quotient by default, because you can understand how people are feeling. You can understand why they're feeling the way they are. You can understand how you can frame things better to where they are more accepting of what you need to tell them. You can get people on the same team, kind of getting them feeling like they're on the same family type of thing. I completely agree with what you're talking about there.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad to hear you're out there, singing from the same hymn book, as it were. Because we need evangelizers around this. We
I
need
agree.
dads. We need community leaders. We need strong fellows like yourselves to guide the way, and it's hard because it's fun to go online. It's fun to go on Tinder. It's fun to go on Instagram for these kids. They love that. It's fun to do TikTok. But the idea is we also need to set aside these other times. If, for example, socializing online was a one-for-one exchange with face-to-face socialization, I don't think we'd see the levels of the anxieties and the depressions and the loneliness that we're seeing today.
Yeah.
So that's my thing. It's there, but it's not a one-for-one. And there's other things like that hug that brings out oxytocin. Like, you don't get that online through those interactions, for example. So
no, that's a physiological response.
That's right. So I think that, again, maybe the workplace is the place to start. And other organizations like churches, like community groups, if they can bring ways to bring people together and create these experiences, and even retail, for example, or hospitality, the same thing. Bring together experiences where people can come and create something for them. I think it'll be very helpful.
Wow. Well, Julie, I really appreciate your time with us today, and I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this stuff. I think it's really important that people need to gain some meta-awareness into their own lives and their own thinking, and how this crazy changing world is changing their mind and changing how their brain physiology works, and how their gray matter is reacting to things, and how it's like one of the first things that I mentioned in my first book, or my second book, is look, I have 8.5 seconds to gain your attention, because that's how long the human attention span is, thanks to these devices that show us a brand new headline if we're not interested in the last one. And we're now having an attention span shorter than that of a common goldfish at 9 seconds. And so we need to take control of this stuff a little bit. Otherwise, we're going to be a bunch of mush, mental mush at the end of this century. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. And if there was one book that I would suggest people read this year, it would be Mind Hacking Happiness by Sean Webb. But if there was a second book that I would suggest that they read, it would be Left to Their Own Devices by Julie Albright, because this is an amazing tome with a ton of awesome stories and anecdotes and science that is well researched. And I mean, kudos to you on this thing. This is amazing.
Thank you so much. And it's been such a great conversation with you guys, and you've really taken it to another level. And I hope you'll just keep on this path, because it's important for, you know, for our society, and you guys are doing something great there.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll take a rain check, and we'll have to revisit in about a year. We'll have you back on and continue this conversation. What do you say?
I would love it.
Have a great rest of your day, Julie. For you guys watching out there, don't forget to hit that like button and the subscribe button, and share this with your friends, because this is the stuff that will change your life. This is the stuff that will allow you to take back control of what communications paradigms and shifts and technology are doing to our brains, which then become plastic over time and start to rule your life. Again, you got to rule your mind, or it will rule you, as the immortal words of Horace are written. Thanks. Talk to you guys soon. Peace.